Welcome to the latest episode, and this is the summary episode. This is the important episode of Series 5, and I am joined by, I don't know what title, the venerable, the highly super experienced Saffron Cordery, who is the Deputy Chief Exec of NHS Providers. Saffron, welcome to the podcast. Why don't you introduce yourself and give a little glimpse into Saffron world?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew, and thanks for that really nice intro. So I'm Saffron Cordery, Deputy Chief Executive at NHS Providers, and as Matthew and I were chatting about earlier, I've been there for a really long time and have probably seen a lot of changes come through in terms of the form and shape of trusts in their various incarnations. I've been responsible at NHS Providers for looking at the whole of our externally facing activity, really, whether that's policy development, whether that's communications, whether that's the support that we offer to our member trusts. Before I entered the world of health, I led the policy and influencing bit of the local government association, and I think never before has that local government experience been more helpful than now when we think about the really important interface between kind of local accountability more broadly and local health services and the challenges we see in things like social care. And I started working life in community and adult education.
Just about every public experience possible, Saffron. Maybe not criminal justice, although I'm sure you dabbled in different elements at some point.
Yes, I have actually. I'm co-chair of a charity called Agenda Alliance, which supports women and girls with multiple needs, and particularly in their interface with criminal justice. So I lob that in as well.
I will stop probing because I bet we'll find you doing something somewhere. So whilst it will be a fascinating conversation, yes, it will take us off topic.
Not why we're here.
We're here to Series 5 of the podcast has been looking at mergers and of NHS trust, foundation trusts, and group models, and kind of getting perspectives on both. And Saffron, I mean, NHS Providers was set up, and you probably were there at the beginning to support people that were moving originally from the NHS trust world into the foundation trust pipeline and to become foundation trusts. So should we just start with your perspective? Because we're recording this the day after the NHS 10-year plan, the government plan in the UK, has been published. It opens the door back up for NHS trusts to become foundation trusts. Let's just start with that kind of dynamic of freedoms, responsibilities for boards that the foundation trust movement were meant to bring in, and just a bit of a statement of where do you think we are in that world.
Thanks, Matthew. And yeah, I read the 10-year plan. Obviously it's so long awaited. Everyone has been just like, when is this thing coming out? Finally we've got it. So and it's a little bit of check on delivery against all of the leaks that we've seen so far, but I did read it with keen interest through that foundation trust lens, because it feels to me that we are in a situation where we are definitely back to the future in terms of thinking about how do we create that appropriate framework where we've got freedoms that people need, but that we're making sure that they are appropriately held to account. And I think so much is familiar in what we see in the 10-year plan, with these kind of opening up the FT pipeline once again, thinking about, trust authorization into foundation trust status, deauthorization, an interesting one there, and also thinking about what that means. I think the real difference now is the context, and I think that what I hope we will see is a foundation trust model for a new age, because, it's 20 years since that previous legislation was passed and so much has changed. so much has changed in terms of demand, so much has changed in terms of public expectation, so much has changed in terms of population health, etc., etc. So we are in a really different time. But what I still hold on to is the concept of enabling organizations to have appropriate freedoms to really enable their organizations to innovate, to be entrepreneurial, to really support their staff, their patients, their local populations, to really push up the quality of what they do by giving freedoms where those freedoms are appropriate, but having around it a set of rules that people understand, having around it a set of really robust accountabilities. So you can ask lots of questions around the effectiveness of foundation trust governors, for example, but those governors played an important role in holding boards to account. The original model of commissioner and provider split meant that there was a pretty robust relationship between the then primary care trusts and foundation trusts delivering services. And, at the beginning of the foundation trust experiment first time round, we had a really robust regulator that very clearly held organisations to account, and every foundation trust reported directly into Parliament as well. So we had a very different framework there. And I think that it wasn't perfect. There were flaws with that. And I think we saw that in some places that, shall I say, robust sovereignty that some organisations exerted perhaps didn't work to, in the best interests of the whole of a local provider landscape. But it did enable some really important steps forward in terms of moving the nature of service provision forward, giving people the opportunity to spend the money that they had in their coffers in a very different way.
And I'll move on to the group models in a moment, because I think that's an interesting development within the vein of foundation trust and or NHS trust. But just to touch on a couple of things there, Saffron, you mentioned foundation trust model for a new age. The context is different, and then you went on to talk about the sovereignty. I don't like the word sovereignty in terms of NHS organisations, because I think whether you're an FT or an NHS trust, you're a public benefit organisation paid for by taxpayers' money. Therefore, sovereignty should never be in our lexicon. But I wonder whether, therefore, the context, though, is foundation trusts must serve the population rather than their self-interest, and that's maybe where we need to get the balance right in the new authorization and the regulatory realm. Is they have to be doing all the things that you say, but actually the outcome is better population outcomes, and that never was a dynamic that people were judged against, was it?
No, I think that is really fair. I think that where that perhaps could have and should have come in would have been so this notion of the commissioner provider split that we saw back in the original kind of FT model, I think was really about how commissioners understand the needs and commission services from providers in a way that met local population health needs, and obviously providers would be in a position to also, think about the services that they could also provide that would meet that need. I'm not really sure that we saw that play out properly, but I think your point is absolutely critical. I don't like the word sovereignty either. I think that there is, there are many different ways of expressing that, and I actually think the important bit around perhaps FTs for a new age, is to think about that genuine board oversight and accountability, because that is the really important bit, which is any kind of freedoms have to come with really strong accountabilities. And that's where I think the crux of this is. It doesn't matter what you call them. Perhaps reinventing foundation trusts is perhaps not what they should have been called. That perhaps if they'd been called something else, then we would be developing a different model without the overlay from the past. But I think the important thing is that really robust accountability and line of sight. Boards' ownership of the quality of what they provide, whether they're working with other organisations, whether they're on the pathway to merger, whether they're very solidly standalone organisations. That accountability is absolutely critical.
And so that takes us into lots of the content from our great contributors in Series 5. And I've talked to Liverpool, Warwickshire, Northamptonshire, Bedfordshire, Bristol, and Ipswich, Colchester, World, to name a few. And what strikes me out of those conversations is they all have tried to make a difference by pushing the boundaries on different types of organizational forms, some mergers, some from group models. They're all, secondly, very different, and the genesis of why they started that are all very different as well. And then thirdly, I have been quite amazed that when we think going back to your earlier experience in the authorization process of the original foundation trusts, we've now have organizations that are huge. I think in Liverpool and Bristol, both of them knocking into 1.5 billion to 2 billion pounds of expenditure. The process for them to become a group, and I'm not saying they're doing anything wrong here, but has been very light compared to an FT process. And I think that goes to your point of how do we get boards to be really serious about what they're doing and take accountability and then have those freedoms when they're doing these huge operations. And I'm not sure whether we've got that balance right. What's your kind of perspective into that space about those boards and how they therefore go about their business?
Yeah, that is absolutely critical. So I think just thinking about your first 2 points there, the nature of the different types of groups or collaborations, and then their genesis. So if I can just go off on a little cul-de-sac first, which is, I think there is something so important about how we configure different types of collaboration in order to match local circumstance. Because I think this is the other bit that comes with all of the freedoms, flexibilities piece, which is what's the local context. And I think there's been a lot of frustration around in terms of there not being that much central guidance around how this process has been done. I think a mature sector like the NHS delivery sector should embrace that to an extent, because it's really, really important to be able to say we are doing what our local population needs, what our region needs, depending on the scale. So I think having that freedom to be able to really conceive the notion of what you want to do in your area because it meets local need is really critical. And that will also link to the genesis point. What's the reason that you are doing it? Is it because you've basically your money is a burning platform and the economy of scale is the only way that you're going to get through this? Or is it linked to that, is it a clinical strategy that will really help drive up quality on your patch? Those are both probably interlinked, but also very important factors in all of this. And I think,
and I thought on that, Saffron, I thought James up in Liverpool was really crystal clear on that. He was very much saying the individual organizations were failing their local population, not
yes,
because they were not necessarily delivering the wrong care, but they together, their aggregate impact was mean that the population health was getting worse. So therefore they needed to do something different, and their arrangements has started to drive change in their approach. I thought it was a very, very great way, but I think quite a mature kind of analysis of, and it's hard to do, is we're not doing this well enough. We need to structurally as well as culturally do something different.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think there are two things that we need. One is we need a really compelling set of underpinning principles to guide what people are doing. So I think that in different groupings coming together, as long as it is being done for the right reason, that feels really, really important. It's got to be, is this improving the health of the local population? Is it delivering the taxpayer value? Is it improving the public's experience? Is it making a doable task for our staff up and down the country? And are we running these organizations with appropriate governance underpinning? Those kind of elements feel really important to me. I do also think, and this comes back to your point around, the kind of FT authorization process versus the looser arrangements we've had with the group models and other collaborations, is I do think that the last decade or so, we have, what I think was important about the FT era, if we can call it that, was the fact that we were operating very much in a rules-based system. And I think those rules were not necessarily suspended, but they did fall away, actually, over time, almost as soon as, and I'm not being an advocate for the Lansley legislation by any stretch, because we know time has told us that it was intensely flawed in many ways. But we felt lots of what we saw in the, actually, on the one hand, the strengthening of foundation trust that we saw in that 2012 legislation, actually then when it was implemented came with a falling away of the rules-based system. So that was a very difficult situation for any individual organization to navigate. And I think we then saw a little bit of the Wild West, really, in terms of policy and rules. So I think having a rules-based system, from my perspective, is really important, because when the framework and structure is really clear, that is when you can have those freedoms, those flexibilities, and that appropriate autonomy for organizations within a framework, within a set of principles. So that feels really important to me. The bit around, the FT authorization process, it was a process, it was robust. I think we all know that in many ways it had its flaws. It was only after mid-staffs that we saw a greater focus on quality governance, for example. And I think we can see that in some areas it did skew a focus on meeting a test, a bar to get over. I think we do know, though, that if you go for a raw merger, the level of scrutiny there is also pretty high. And so, I think if you're going through that process, then it's, if not entirely equivalent, it's pretty similar to an FT authorization process in many ways. I think the value of some of the more flexible arrangements that we've seen, groups, collaborations, people running their organizations with committees in common, is that within that what we haven't seen is a raw dismantling of governance and board accountability. It's that the boards and governance has adapted to the external environment. So I think in all of the examples that you've spoken to, nobody would say that there isn't robust governance in place. In fact, they would probably say there's an awful lot of governance in place, holding to account in different ways. So I think I wouldn't ever want to say that in this kind of context where so much, so many different routes have been taken, I don't think we could ever say that the accountability wasn't there. I think what it's done is put a huge burden on leadership to make that accountability work, and that is really, really challenging for those leaders, whether chief executives, chairs, board members, non-executives.
Yeah, and I'd agree with you there, Saffron. I think of some of the examples, and clearly the groups are structured differently, but I think, again, Liverpool or Bristol, where they've got individual organizations still there, many individual organizations, they've had to work really hard to define what then sits beneath. So that line of sight from team through to organization, through to group board is absolutely crystal clear. I think James, again, in Liverpool, talks very much about enhancing their risk management approach, and that's really benefited them because they've actually understood the undercurrents better with a better framework. I thought interesting in Shane DeGarrett down in London, who have gone into a group and then back again, and one could say that his merged organisation is a formalised way of the group. They've now got a much better collaboration with two other acute hospitals to drive change, but I think it comes. My impression was it had therefore been developed with better governance rather than a loose collaboration. So I think you're right. People clearly have, and in my own experience, in my trusts, we've worked really hard to say it's our job. So let's focus on that for a moment, because we've got quite diverse arrangements now. Before it was quite clear, wasn't it? A foundation trust or an NHS trust, one board, and you could probably codify them all in a very similar way. Now we've got something very different going on. I think it's quite a different job for chairs, chief executives and non-executives to be there. If you're Maria came down in Bristol with nigh on £2 billion worth of public money, 20-odd thousand staff across quite a big geography down to Weston-super-Mare up to the whole of Bristol. What do you think needs to be there for happening around? You talked about a national kind of rules-based framework that supports that to thrive, as well as the local leadership to thrive, because I think those are tough jobs, Saffron.
I think they're hugely tough jobs. I mean, when we look at if you look at the skills that are required, not just to be a trust chief executive, but to be a trust chair right now, particularly in a group model, you cannot do that without significant experience, firstly. So if I think about the Bristol example is a really good one. So we've got Maria Kane and Ingrid Barker, both of whom are hugely experienced in different contexts. And I think, Ingrid has worked previously in bringing two organisations together, and having the means to understand the needs of not just your organization but your local, well, not just local, actually your regional population in order to meet those needs is absolutely critical. And you need to be brilliant really at that collaboration piece, at forging relationships, at being the pragmatic leader, actually, that really understands and knows what can give, as well as what your must-dos are. And I think that feels absolutely fundamental in these contexts. I mean, it's interesting when we conversations we've had, and this sounds like a tangent, but it isn't. Well, it is a tangent, but I hope it serves the point, which is the conversations we've had with NHS England and government around things like very senior manager pay, for example, where, there was conversations about what, how do you pitch the levels of pay for different leaders? And there's always been this conversation, and I'm afraid it's still there, which is basically it's just to do with trust turnover. However, actually, if you look at the nature of the task, I mean, trust turnover is one important signifier of the nature of an organization, but other skills that you need are the ability to create the networks around you, the ability to relate to the other organizations around you. And that will be the case whether you're a very small trust somewhere trying to make your way within a more complex landscape and environment. It will also be the case if you are, a very big group group of trusts working out what the needs are for your population. So, it's a really complex task.
Yeah. And I think when I look at on that point about the skills of the person, I was looking at my notes from the season. Very much, I think there were at least 3 of the chief execs who said it would have been tough to go into the larger group models without experience of how to operate as a director in a group model. You can't just jump from a kind of a chief exec accountable officer in a district general hospital that generally are relatively small and compared to these groups and go straight into it, because it's a different set of skills.
Well, you're kind of jumping 2 rungs in the ladder there, aren't you? If you try to go from one of those,
yeah. And I think what lots of them are, I'm just looking at some of the quotes from people. You can't look at things through a single organizational lens when you're in a group. You're talking about the aggregation of everything. You have to let go, which is hard to do. But I think the flip side of letting go is you also have to make sure, going back to our earlier conversation of governance, you've got fabulously good mature governance so you can let go. I think then the third dynamic in there is you've got to maintain and nurture your leaders below you to govern well, so therefore you're not intervening. And I think a couple of them have said, they know they've hit the right spot when their leadership teams tell them to get out the way as chief executives.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that comes with a degree of humility, doesn't it? That you need that to understand where you are getting in the way rather than enabling. I do think it also, and this is a function of really good governance and accountability, which is that piece around how you, boards, whether they're in a broader collaboration, so they got committees in common, but boards that really know their strengths, their weaknesses, where they need to improve. I think that they are the ones that can kind of most responsibly come together in order to create something that is greater than the sum of its parts. Because if you know where your provision or isn't as strong as it should be, that is the point at which you say, okay, no, that is the point at which your partner organization steps in to deliver that, because they're much better at doing it. So I think that lots of that does feel important, but that does take a maturity of approach. And I'm looking at the people you've spoken to for this, there is no way that you would say that any of the leaders you've spoken to aren't really seasoned, mature leaders who really understand all of the dynamics there. They all do it in really different ways, but that is entirely appropriate.
Although if you listen to Nick Hume's and mine's conversation, you'd describe neither of us as a mature. Let's just be totally honest about it.
I mean, you could say that, Matthew. couldn't possibly comment.
So a few more things, Saffron, just to chew through before we come to an end. I've I've spoken to the pipeline of aspiring chief execs recently, both cohorts, and I think it's an interesting perspective. I think some of them are worried that there are less opportunities for them now because of mergers happening and group models. I'd be interested to hear your perspective because my immediate response has been, well, there are probably less accountable officer roles. That's absolutely true. But there are still some big, chunky, really tough leadership skills that might be called site chief exec, site manager, managing director, etc., that are akin to what were first rungs on the ladder for chief execs, and therefore those don't go away. It's just you're not the accountable officer. And you've done a lot of work from NHS providers over the years with the messenger review and all those things. What's your take on that?
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, if you look at it on paper, yes, the kind of the accountable officer role, there are fewer of them. You know, we're probably 20 or 30 fewer than we were 5 years ago, you know, is absolutely the case. I think there is something here about, from thinking about the whole of the provider system, really making sure that we give appropriate value to those site chief executives, those MD roles, because they are still the really important roles. And those MDs, let's call them that for shorthand, still have to contribute in exactly the same way. They still have to have that line of sight. They are still accountable, and they still need to feed in to the overarching vision for the group or the collaboration. So for me, that does feel really important. I suppose if we were going down the road of, or if we'd been down the road of every organisation that comes together is a merger, then you would see something where actually you've probably got many fewer accountable officers in that way. I think with the groupings, you have got something that not only gives, if we value it properly, not only gives people the appropriate levels of responsibility, accountability, autonomy to do their jobs and be leaders, but also creates a really important pipeline for the future. And that is genuinely what we need. I completely understand the concern of those aspiring chief executives in the programme, because of course that is a concern. But what we know, looking at the raw evidence, is that the NHS choose through chief executives, and it doesn't make the task easy. It's not an easy task. But we also know that we are not awash, you know, with hundreds and hundreds of potential chief executives coming forward. We are looking for them all over the place, and we need to create that pipeline. So doing that, you know, does feel really important. So for me, there is an opportunity there.
And I guess linking your earlier points around flexibility, freedoms for those that are doing well, I guess the reality is the role of a larger group or big merged organization chief exec is to take the commercial freedoms, to take the opportunities, to be working with industry, to do the UK PLC type element, the genomics, the research, the university and face, and say, how can we bring that value to make our healthcare system work better? It is less to do with, in those roles, the hands-on shaping the immediate culture in the teams and making things work. They're still accountable for it, but they're doing less of it. And I think we've just also then got to start redefining some of those things to say we need both of those. And I think it's okay.
Yes, and I think that's absolutely right. I suppose the one danger in that is what we wouldn't want to do is be limiting the exposure of those, say, you know, MD roles, the kind of individual chief executives as part of a group, their exposure to those really important externally facing pieces as well. So that is still the job, isn't it, of the overall accountable officer, to be sharing that bit as well, to create that fully rounded role and that pipeline for the future.
Final bit then, Saffron, I don't know how to describe it. When I think of Saffron, I think of one of the most eminent policy wonks in the NHS. Is that a good thing to be a policy wonk? I mean,
it's not a bad thing in my world.
Exactly. You're a go-to thought leader for things in the NHS. You've worked in this world a lot. As we said earlier, we're recording this day after the NHS plan for the next 10 years, and you've touched already on some of the themes of the new foundation trust, what they should look like. What are your thoughts when we look at I know this is unashamedly about the provider sector, and for those that are in strategic commissioning, we're not talking much about that today. But what's your kind of thoughts about 10-year plan, the state of the sector, and what you hope will happen over the next months and years to kind of really make this fly in a different way?
It's a really good question. I think that I really hope, and this sounds quite basic actually, but I really hope that the government, in particular the Department of Health and Social Care, but more broadly the government, spends some time working really closely with those who are delivering services, because I think to understand how to deliver this vision that they've set out, and I think the 10-year plan is really important. It's a seismic moment. We haven't had a plan like this for a fairly long time. And it feels really important, but there isn't much of the how in there at the moment. And the critical thing often is not what you want people to do, it's how you do it. And I think the government really needs to work with those who are delivering services to kind of tease through how this is going to be done properly, because this is an opportunity. Is it a once in a generation opportunity? I don't know. I think we can overuse that phrase and attribute too much and put too much on them. But I do think working, co-producing this will be absolutely critical. And I think fundamentally respecting, whilst being challenging, but respecting the expertise, the skills, the intentions and the motivations of those who are leading and working in organisations is fundamental.
And I guess that those are really salient points. I guess also the balance in there is what you said earlier about is then resetting the kind of national rules, so there is a proper accountability frame, so you can actually know that people are doing a good job. I think those two things probably go together, don't they?
Yes, they do. And I do think and we've seen it in there. We've heard Jim Mackey talk about it a bit already, and we've seen it in some of the 10-year plan, but a return to more of a rules-based system, I think, will be helpful for everybody.
Yeah. Well, that rules-based is a ... of course.
Yes, indeed.
Saffron, you've been fabulous as ever. I mean, just listening back to you talk about the kind of beginning of that foundation trust world, where it started, what it was meant to be doing. I thought it was interesting points about it benefited, even though it didn't get it always right, from a tough regulator that was really clear on the outcomes, but how that world has changed, how I thought the principles that you stated about what actually any group or any arrangement should have. I think you talked about value, you talked about staff, you talked about the improvements in population and being well governed. Those are four really impressive totemic things that any change needs to be kind of braced around. And an area that I know you've been passionate over the years is making sure that the governance and the leadership, both executive and non-executive, is supported and developed and is held central to an accountability framework that people can deliver care. Really interesting. Thank you for your insights. Thank you to all the people that contributed in Series 5. I learned a lot. And I live in this world and always learn a lot from you. So thank you for joining me on Leadership and Culture in Healthcare.
Thank you so much for asking me.